The winter of 1944 did not just bring cold. It brought a chilling clarity. On the blood-soaked Eastern Front, where entire armies vanished into the snow and mud, a new kind of predator prowled the battlefield. It was a machine of such immense power and terrifying reputation that its mere presence could break the morale of an enemy battalion. This was the Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Osf B, the King Tiger. And from the commander's cupola of one such beast, Hauptmann Friedrich Schulz felt, for a fleeting moment, like a god of war. Schulz was not a fanatic. He was an engineer by trade, a man who understood the fine tolerances of steel, the intricate dance of gears, and the brutal physics of ballistics. He saw his King Tiger not as a product of ideology, but as the ultimate expression of German engineering genius. It was a 70-ton fortress on treads, its frontal armor so thick that it was said enemy shells would simply liquefy upon impact. Its heart was a monstrous 88mm cannon, a weapon capable of killing any Allied or Soviet tank from a mile away, long before the enemy was even in range to fight back. For Schulz and his crew, sealed within this cathedral of steel, the war felt winnable. It felt logical. That morning had been proof. His crew, seasoned veterans, had operated with the precision of a surgical team. They had stalked, they had aimed, and they had fired. 7 Soviet T-34 seconds, the workhorses of the Red Army, now lay scattered across the frozen plain, their hulls torn open, burning like funeral pyres against the grey sky. 7 kills, no return fire had even scratched their paint. Schulz allowed himself a thin smile, the smell of cordite and hot metal filling his lungs. It was a smell of victory. He raised his binoculars, scanning the horizon, expecting to see the remnants of the Soviet assault scattering in panic. That was the doctrine. That was the expected outcome when lesser machines faced perfection. But he saw no panic. He saw no retreat. What he saw instead made the cold seep past his thick wool collar and into his very bones. It wasn't an army anymore. It was a force of nature. From over the horizon, a dark line resolved itself into shapes, dozens of them, then scores. A river of steel flowing inexorably towards his position. He kept counting, his mind struggling to process the scale of it. 20, 30, 40 more T-34 seconds. Their engines a low, collective growl that promised retribution. They weren't charging wildly. They were advancing with a grim, almost casual determination, as if the 7 smoldering wrecks in front of them were nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a pothole on their road to Berlin. They just kept coming. It was in that moment that the fundamental truth of his war shifted. The pride he felt in his superior machine, in his crew's flawless skill, evaporated. It was replaced by a profound, hollow dread. All his training, all the technical brilliance poured into his magnificent Tiger, all the lives spent perfecting this killing machine. None of it mattered in the face of this bile, this monstrous arithmetic. His personal log, recovered years later from the wreckage of a forgotten battlefield, was said to contain an entry from that night that distilled the entire industrial war into a single, terrifying thought. We had destroyed a platoon, and in response, they sent a battalion. We destroyed the battalion, and they sent a division. I realized then that we were no longer fighting men. We were fighting a factory, an assembly line that stretched all the way back to the Urals. It was in that moment, watching the endless tide, that I knew. Our 88mm cannon could pierce any armor in the world, but it could not pierce the laws of mathematics. This chilling epiphany was not unique to Hauptmann Schulz. On the Western Front, in the dense forests of the Ardennes and the treacherous hedgerows of Normandy, other German commanders, men like the legendary Michael Wittmann, were coming to the same horrifying conclusion. They were titans of tactical combat, their Tiger tanks seemingly invincible, racking up kill ratios of 10, sometimes 20 to 1. Yet, for every Allied tank they destroyed, 2 more seemed to appear. For every victory they won on the battlefield, they were losing a war being waged on spreadsheets and factory floors thousands of miles away. This is not the story of a single battle. It is the story of a calculation, a brutal, relentless mathematical equation that determined the fate of the Second World War long before the final shots were fired. It's the story of why the most feared, most technologically advanced, and most masterfully engineered tank of its time was ultimately defeated by an opponent that was, by comparison, mediocre. A tank so prone to catching fire that its own crews gave it a grim nickname, the Ronson Lighter, after the popular slogan, "Lights up the first time, every time." How did 1,347 German Tigers, the supposed pinnacle of armored warfare, fall to 49,234 American M4 Shermans? How did perfection lose to good enough? The answer is not found in the schematics of a transmission or the muzzle velocity of a cannon. It cannot be measured in the thickness of armor plate or the skill of a gunner. To find the answer, we must look deeper. We must journey from the Führer's paranoid obsessions in his wolf's lair to the roaring factories of Detroit. We must understand that this was not merely a war of machines, but a war of philosophies. The answer lies buried in the very soul of the two nations that built them. To understand the vast, unbridgeable chasm that separated the Tiger and the Sherman, one must first leave the battlefield and enter the minds of the men who willed them into existence. These tanks were not just steel and wire, they were the physical embodiment of two radically different worldviews, two national philosophies forged in the crucible of total war. One was born of obsession, the other of pragmatism. Our first journey takes us to the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, a damp, mosquito-infested command complex hidden deep in the forests of East Prussia. Here, isolated from the grim realities of the front lines, Adolf Hitler waged a war of ideology. He was a man possessed by the idea of the Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapon. In his worldview, the war was not a contest of resources, a fight he knew Germany was losing, but a clash of wills, a struggle where the superior spirit and technical genius of the Aryan race would ultimately triumph. He didn't need more tanks. He needed better tanks. He needed an invincible land battleship, a Teutonic knight clad in Krupp steel that could shatter the morale of the subhuman hordes he believed were arrayed against him. In early 1941, long before America entered the war, this obsession became policy. The order, a direct Führerbefehl, was issued. Germany required a heavy tank that could dominate any battlefield. It had to be impenetrable, its gun capable of destroying anything the enemy could field. Cost was a secondary concern. Production speed was an afterthought. Perfection was the only metric that mattered. The project became a frantic competition between Germany's top engineering firms, Henschel and Porsche. They weren't asked to design a weapon. They were asked to create a legend. The result was the Tiger I, a machine born from a dictator's demand for a technological silver bullet. It wasn't a tank designed by soldiers for a specific tactical need. It was a monument to an ideology, a rolling testament to the belief that sheer quality could defy the crushing weight of quantity. Now, let us travel thousands of miles away, from the paranoid claustrophobia of the Wolf's Lair to the pragmatic, business-like atmosphere of Washington, D.C. Here, another leader faced a completely different problem. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was not thinking about a single, invincible weapon. He was thinking on a planetary scale. He looked at a world on fire and saw a massive, terrifying logistics problem. Britain was running out of everything. The Soviet Union was screaming for tanks and trucks. And soon, America itself would need to field an army of millions. The question wasn't how to build the best tank in the world. The question was how to build tens of thousands of them, ship them across 2 oceans, and keep them running in every conceivable climate, from the deserts of Africa to the frozen steppes of Russia. His solution was not a general or a weapons designer. It was a man named William S. Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who had risen from the factory floor to become the president of General Motors. Knudsen was the living embodiment of American industrial might. When Roosevelt brought him to Washington to lead the Office of Production Management, Knudsen didn't talk about strategy or doctrine. He talked about supply chains, standardization, and man-hours. He laid out a philosophy that was the polar opposite of Hitler's. It was a philosophy that would become the bedrock of the Allied victory. In a now famous statement that should be etched onto the walls of every war college, Knudsen declared, "We are not going to make the best planes or the best tanks. We are going to make the most of them." This wasn't an admission of inferiority. It was a declaration of a revolutionary, industrial age warfare doctrine. Knudsen understood a fundamental truth that Hitler, in his ideological bubble, could not grasp. A good enough tank, fighting on the front line today, is infinitely more valuable than a perfect tank that will be ready in 6 months. A tank crew can be trained in weeks. A skilled machinist takes years to develop. Therefore, the tank must be simple. Simple to build, simple to operate, and most importantly, simple to repair. This is where the M4 Sherman was born. It wasn't the product of a single, visionary command. It was the result of a collaboration between the U.S. Army Ordnance Department and the industrial titans of America, Chrysler, Ford, General Motors. This was not a top-down order from a dictator. It was a contract, a challenge issued to the world's greatest manufacturing power. The goal was not to create a work of art, but to create a reliable, easily mass-produced tool. The Sherman was designed around its engine, a pre-existing Wright aircraft radial engine, simply because there were factories already equipped to build thousands of them. It was designed to use components that could be manufactured by different companies and still fit together perfectly. It was, from its very first blueprint, a machine built for the assembly line. So the battle lines were drawn, not in the mud of a battlefield, but in the philosophies of two nations. In Germany, a totalitarian regime, driven by the ego of one man, demanded an artisanal masterpiece, a symbol of supposed racial superiority. In America, a democratic government partnered with its capitalist industrial base to create a weapon for the common soldier, a tool designed for overwhelming, relentless production. One side sought a god of war, the other built an army of mortals. These dueling philosophies were about to transform the very factory floors of Cassel and Detroit into ideological battlegrounds. The question was, which ideology would build the war-winning machine? The philosophies born in the minds of Hitler and Knudsen were now put to the test on the factory floor. And it was here, amidst the roar of furnaces and the scream of metal, that the war of production was truly won and lost. The factories that built the Tiger and the Sherman were not just buildings. They were different universes, operating on different laws of physics and morality. First, let's step inside the Henschel and Son works in Kassel, Germany. To call it a factory is almost a misnomer. It was more akin to a massive, state-sponsored workshop for artisans. Here, the process of building a Tiger tank was slow, deliberate, and breathtakingly complex. Highly skilled German engineers and master craftsmen, men who had spent their entire lives perfecting their trade, would hover over each chassis. Every weld was inspected, every gear was custom-fitted, every armored plate was painstakingly machined. One former engineer described the process with a chilling lack of awareness for the war's urgency. "We spent 3 days just on the final drive assembly." You see, it was not mass production, it was art. But this art had a dark, rotten core. By 1943, the German war machine was critically short on manpower. To fill the gaps on their assembly lines, the Nazi regime turned to one of its most monstrous tools: slave labor. Hundreds of thousands of Zwangsarbeiter, forced laborers from occupied territories in Poland, Russia, and France, were shipped to factories like Henschel. These were not motivated workers. They were starving, brutalized men and women working under the constant threat of the whip and the gun. And they fought back, in the only way they could. An incorrectly tightened bolt here, a handful of sand in an oil lubricant there, a deliberately flawed weld on a non-critical seam. These small acts of sabotage were impossible to detect during inspections. Yet they would manifest months later as catastrophic failures on a frozen Russian road or in the heat of battle in France. The Tiger's infamous mechanical unreliability wasn't just a flaw of its complex design. It was a symptom of the moral bankruptcy of the regime that built it. The pursuit of perfection, was being actively undermined by the inhumanity required to attempt it. Now, let's leave this grim workshop of coerced art and travel to a place that could not have been more different: the Detroit Tank Arsenal. This was not a workshop. This was a symphony of industrial power. Commissioned in 1940 and run by Chrysler, it was a single building so vast that it had its own weather systems. From the moment you stepped inside, you were hit by a wall of sound: the deafening clang of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, the roar of engines being tested, all overlaid with the constant, rhythmic rumble of the assembly line. It was the sound of a nation waking up. Here, the philosophy was speed, volume, and simplicity. A Sherman tank didn't begin its life as a unique chassis. It began as thousands of identical parts, forged and stamped and cast by hundreds of different subcontractors across 47 states. These parts would flow into the arsenal on a never-ending stream of trains and trucks, converging on the main assembly line. And on that line stood a new American army. This army didn't wear uniforms. They were women, many of whom had never held a tool more complex than a kitchen whisk before. They were African-American men who had migrated from the South, seeking opportunity and a chance to fight for a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. They were teenage boys, fresh off the farm, too young to enlist, but old enough to build the machines their older brothers would take into battle. This was the true face of Rosie the Riveter. Consider the story of Mary Krivsky, a young welder from Michigan. Her fiancé, Johnny, was a sergeant in the 3rd Infantry Division, fighting his way up the bloody boot of Italy. Every day, Mary would step onto the line, pull down her heavy mask, and lay down bead after bead of molten steel, fusing the Sherman's armor together. For her, every weld was a prayer. A prayer that this tank, the one her hands were helping to create, would be strong enough. A prayer that it would be the one to save Johnny's life. She, and millions like her, weren't building tanks because a guard with a rifle told them to. They were building them with a fierce, personal purpose. This was the profound power of a democracy at war. It could mobilize not just the hands, but the hearts of its entire population. This fundamental difference in workforce and philosophy led to a production disparity that still beggars belief. The numbers tell the story. To build one Tiger I tank required an astonishing 300,000 man-hours. To build one M4 Sherman? Just over 10,000. In their peak production month, the German factories managed to produce 104 Tiger tanks. In their peak production month, American factories churned out over 3,500 Shermans. A single American factory, the Detroit Arsenal, could produce more tanks in a single week than the entire German Tiger program could in a month. And the final tally, the number that truly sealed the fate of the Panzerwaffe. Over the course of the war, Germany produced a total of 1,347 Tiger I tanks. America and its allies produced 49,234 M4 Shermans. These figures represent more than just an industrial imbalance. They are the final result of the clash between two opposing ideals. The Germans built a few exquisite, unreliable pieces of art using slave labor. The Americans built a tidal wave of simple, reliable tools with a motivated, free workforce. The numbers tell us what happened behind the factory gates. But once these steel beasts rolled out into the chaos of war, their birth philosophies would dictate their lives and their deaths in ways no one could have fully imagined. The real-world consequences of this production gap were about to become terrifyingly clear. Once a tank rolls off the assembly line, the battle for production ends, and a new, more unforgiving war begins. The war of logistics. On the chaotic, far-flung battlefields of World War II, a weapon was only as good as its supply chain, and it was here, in the brutal calculus of fuel, maintenance, and repair, that the Tiger's artistic perfection became its own worst enemy, while the Sherman's mundane simplicity became its greatest strategic asset. For a German panzer division, the arrival of a new Tiger tank was a cause for celebration, but for its quartermaster, it was the beginning of a logistical nightmare. The Tiger was a thirsty beast. It consumed over 5 gallons of high-grade gasoline just to travel 1 mile, more than double the consumption of a Sherman. In a nation crippled by oil shortages, where the Luftwaffe was grounding its planes for lack of fuel, keeping a handful of Tigers running was a strategic drain on the entire war effort. Many Tigers weren't destroyed in combat. They were simply abandoned by their crews when their fuel tanks ran dry, left to be captured and studied by amazed Allied engineers. But fuel was only the beginning of the problem. The Tiger's maintenance schedule was tyrannical. Its design, a marvel of precision, was also a nightmare of complexity. The most infamous example was its interleaved road wheel system. To improve traction and provide a stable firing platform, the Tiger had a series of large, overlapping wheels. It looked impressive, but in the field, it was a catastrophe. On the Eastern Front, mud and snow would pack between the wheels and freeze solid overnight, immobilizing the 70-ton tank completely. Crews had to build fires next to their own tanks just to thaw them out. And if a single inner road wheel was damaged, to replace it, a maintenance crew had to remove up to 9 of the outer wheels first, a task that could take a specialized team with heavy equipment over 12 hours, often in the open, under threat of artillery fire. The official German estimate was that a Tiger required 10 hours of maintenance for every single hour it spent in operation. Worse still, because each Tiger was a semi-artisanal product, its parts were not always interchangeable. A transmission from one Tiger might not fit perfectly in another. This meant that a damaged Tiger couldn't be easily cannibalized for parts. It had to wait for a specific, custom-made replacement to be shipped from a factory hundreds of miles away, a factory that was likely being bombed into rubble by Allied air raids. Now, consider the life of a Sherman. It was, in the words of one American GI, like a farm tractor with armor on it. And that was its genius. Its standardized parts and simple construction meant that what broke could be fixed, often by the crew themselves with a standard set of tools. That dreaded 12-hour wheel replacement on a Tiger, a Sherman's entire wheel and suspension unit could be swapped out in under an hour. And the transmission, the mechanical heart of any tank, an experienced American maintenance team could pull out a Sherman's entire transmission and replace it with a new one in just 4 hours, right there, behind the front lines. The Sherman was designed not just to be built, but to be rebuilt. Damaged tanks were not abandoned. They were dragged back, repaired, and sent back into the fight, sometimes in less than a day. This fundamental difference in battlefield sustainability led to a stark and deeply moral divergence in philosophy. It wasn't just about machines anymore. It was about the men inside them. This was the morality of math. The German philosophy, dictated by the massive investment in each Tiger, became, the machine is priceless. At 300,000 man-hours, each Tiger represented a monumental national effort. It was an irreplaceable asset. Therefore, the crew had an implicit duty to protect the machine at all costs. This led to a culture where crews would often stay with a disabled tank, fighting to the last man to prevent its capture. The machine's preservation was paramount, even over the lives of the highly trained men operating it. The American philosophy, born from a sea of endless replacements, was the exact opposite. The crew is priceless. At a mere 10,000 man-hours, a Sherman was a consumable good. It was ammunition. The men inside, however, were not. A new tank could be requested by radio and delivered tomorrow. A new, experienced, and cohesive crew took months to forge. This philosophy was built right into the tank's design. Compared to the Tiger, the Sherman had larger, easier-to-use escape hatches for the driver and crew. Later models introduced wet stowage, surrounding the ammunition racks with a jacket of water and glycerine, which dramatically reduced the likelihood of the catastrophic fires that gave the Sherman its Ronson nickname. The doctrine taught to every American tanker was clear. If you are hit, get out. Get out, fall back, and we will give you another tank. The results of these opposing moral equations were written in blood. While precise, All-encompassing figures are debated by historians. Battlefield studies revealed a horrifying disparity. The crew of a Tiger tank, fighting to defend their priceless machine, suffered casualty rates estimated to be as high as 75% over the course of the war. They were tied to a sinking ship. In contrast, the survivability of a Sherman crew, encouraged to abandon their expendable vehicle, was remarkably high. The U.S. Army's own studies showed that the crew casualty rate per tank knocked out was a mere fraction of that, often in the single digits. American tankers died, but they didn't die for a piece of equipment. They died fighting. And if they survived a lost tank, they would fight again. So, on one side, you had a system that sacrificed its soldiers to save its machines. On the other, a system that sacrificed its machines to save its soldiers. The logistical and moral lines were clearly drawn. But how did this play out when steel finally met steel? When a single, peerless hunter, crewed by men who knew their tank was a national treasure, faced a pack of seemingly disposable machines, crewed by men who knew they were the ones who truly mattered? What happened in the duel itself? Let's be unequivocally clear. In a one-on-one confrontation, a straightforward duel on an open field, the M4 Sherman stood almost no chance against a Tiger. To suggest otherwise would be an insult to the men who had to face them. The Tiger was a predator, purpose-built to kill other tanks. Its 88mm cannon could punch straight through the Sherman's frontal armor from over 1,000 yards away, a distance at which the Sherman's own 75mm gun could do little more than scratch the Tiger's paint. American tankers were not naive. They knew their machine's limitations. They were acutely aware that they were not in the better tank. This knowledge created a palpable fear on the front lines, a phenomenon known as Tigerphobia. The mere rumor of a Tiger operating in the area could stall an entire advance. A veteran of the Normandy campaign recounted the feeling. When you saw a Tiger, it was like running into a brick wall you didn't know was there. Everything stopped. Your heart went into your throat, and you just prayed. You prayed that it hadn't seen you yet. So, if a duel was suicide, how did they fight back? The answer came not from trying to outmatch the Tiger, but by refusing to fight on its terms. The Americans, with their endless supply of machines and their pragmatic doctrine, didn't see a tank-on-tank duel. They saw a math problem. If one of their tanks was worth a fraction of the enemy's, the solution was simple: bring more tanks. This gave birth to the wolf-pack tactic, a desperate but often effective strategy. Standard U.S. Army doctrine evolved. A single Sherman was never to engage a Tiger alone. Instead, an entire platoon of 4 or 5 Shermans would converge on the target. The fight would unfold like a deadly ballet. One Sherman, often the platoon leader, would take on the near-suicidal role of the bait. He would fire at the Tiger's thick front armor, a move designed not to destroy it, but to attract its attention. The loud clang of the useless 75mm round hitting the Tiger's glacis plate would cause the German commander to traverse his massive turret and focus on the immediate threat. This was the moment the trap was sprung. The Tiger's turret traverse was notoriously slow, powered by a hydraulic system that took a full minute to complete a 360-degree turn. As the fearsome 88mm gun swung around, the other 3 or 4 Shermans would slam their throttles, using their superior speed and mobility to swarm the German behemoth from the flanks and the rear. They were hunters now, racing to get a shot at the Tiger's thinner side armor before it could acquire its next target. It was a brutal, costly, and terrifying way to fight, trading machines and sometimes men for a single kill. But it was rooted in the cold logic of industrial war. They had plenty of Shermans to trade. But the Allies weren't just relying on numbers. This is a crucial point that is often missed. The Sherman was not a static design. While the Germans were pouring all their efforts into a few, perfect, and largely unimprovable models, the Sherman was constantly evolving. It was a platform for rapid, battlefield-driven innovation. This is where the American system showed its true genius, its ability to adapt. When reports came back that the 75mm gun was inadequate, the response wasn't to design a new tank from scratch. The response was to fix the tank they had. Newer models of the Sherman were quickly upgunned with a more powerful, higher velocity 76mm cannon. While still not a perfect match for the 88mm, it drastically improved the Sherman's odds, allowing it to penetrate the Tiger's front armor at closer ranges. The most significant innovation, however, came from the British. In a remarkable feat of battlefield engineering, they figured out how to mount their formidable 17-pounder anti-tank gun into a standard Sherman turret. The result was the Sherman Firefly. This single modification changed the entire dynamic of armored warfare in Europe. The Firefly's gun could kill a Tiger from the front at combat ranges. It was the great equalizer. German tank commanders quickly learned to fear the Firefly, with its distinctively long cannon, and would order their gunners to target them first in any engagement. This ability to iterate and improve, adding better guns, developing superior ammunition like high-velocity armor-piercing HVAP rounds, improving the suspension for a smoother ride, was a direct result of the good enough philosophy. Because the Sherman was a simple, adaptable platform, it could be changed on the fly. The Allies weren't stuck with a single, perfect design. They had a flexible tool that could be modified to meet the evolving threats of the battlefield. The Hunter was still deadly, but the Swarm was learning. It was growing claws of its own. Through a combination of overwhelming numbers, brutal but effective tactics, and rapid, continuous innovation, the Allies were starting to solve the Tiger problem. But in his bunker, Hitler was not a man who listened to the grim reports from the front. He was not interested in pragmatic solutions. Cornered, increasingly delusional, and still clinging to the belief that a single blow of overwhelming technological force could win the war, he decided to make one last, monumental gamble. He would gather the very best of his remaining panzers, his last legions of Tigers and King Tigers, and hurl them at the weakest point in the American line. He would double down on the philosophy of the perfect weapon, in one final, desperate attempt to turn the tide. The forests of the Ardennes were about to become the ultimate testing ground for two warring gods. By the winter of 1944, the German war machine was on the verge of collapse. The Red Army was closing in from the east, and the Western Allies, having broken out from Normandy, were pushing relentlessly toward the Rhine. For any rational leader, the war was lost. But Adolf Hitler was no longer a rational leader. He was a cornered animal, a gambler playing his last hand. And so, in the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, he unleashed his final, most audacious gamble, Operation Watch on the Rhine, known to the world as the Battle of the Bulge. This was to be the ultimate test, the final, apocalyptic clash between the two warring philosophies. Hitler stripped every other front of its best armored units, assembling a fearsome spearhead of elite SS Panzer divisions. This was the cream of the crop, spearheaded by the most terrifying tank ever to see the battlefield, the King Tiger. Even larger, more heavily armored, and equipped with an even more powerful version of the 88mm cannon, the King Tiger was the physical embodiment of Hitler's belief in technological supremacy. His plan was simple and delusional. This invincible armored fist would punch through the thinly held American lines, race to the port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies in two, and force them to sue for peace. It was the Tiger philosophy taken to its absolute extreme. The initial assault, launched under the cover of a brutal winter storm, was a stunning success. The American divisions holding the line were caught completely by surprise. They were mostly green troops, sent to the quiet Ardennes sector to rest and refit. Suddenly, out of the swirling snow and fog, these monsters appeared. Shermans were swatted aside, like toys. Entire companies were overrun. The American line didn't just bend, it broke. For a few frantic days, it seemed Hitler's mad gamble might actually work. But then, the Ardennes itself began to fight back. The narrow, winding, muddy roads of the forest were a death trap for the German behemoths. The King Tigers, so mighty on open ground, found themselves stuck in colossal traffic jams, crawling along at a snail's pace. And their fatal flaw, their mechanical unreliability, exacerbated by slave labor sabotage, emerged with a vengeance in the freezing cold. Transmissions failed, engines seized, fuel lines froze. For every King Tiger lost in combat, 2 more were simply abandoned on the side of a road, broken down or out of fuel. The mighty armored spearhead, the key to the entire operation, was grinding to a halt, defeated not by American guns, but by its own crushing weight and complexity. On the American side, the response to the crisis was a testament to the opposing philosophy. The losses were horrific, but the system was designed to absorb them. The coal went out, and the logistical miracle began. From massive depots in France and Belgium, a torrent of supplies began to flow towards the front. Most importantly, new tanks. Consider the story of a young sergeant named Tom Hogan. His Sherman was hit by a King Tiger on the first day of the offensive near Street Vith. The tank brewed up instantly, but he and 2 of his crew managed to bail out, escaping with minor burns. They spent a terrifying night hiding in the frozen woods before making it back to American lines. They were exhausted, defeated, and grieving their lost friends. They expected to be sent to the rear for a long recovery. Instead, after a hot meal and a medical checkup, a major approached them. "Hogan," he said, "get your men. There's a brand new M4A3 waiting for you at the railhead. You're back in the fight." Within 24 hours of losing their tank, they were driving another one, identical to the last, rumbling back towards the battle. For them, the war continued. For the German crew whose King Tiger had broken its final drive 10 miles down that same road, their war was over. There was no replacement waiting for them. This personal story was magnified to an epic scale. While the German offensive was literally running out of gas, General George S. Patton performed one of the most stunning logistical feats in military history. In the middle of a blizzard, he completely reoriented his entire Third Army, turning it 90 degrees and launching a massive counterattack into the southern flank of the German advance. He could only dare to attempt such a move because he had absolute faith in the American system of supply. He knew that the fuel, the ammunition, and the replacement tanks would be there. His German counterparts, paralyzed by shortages, could only watch in disbelief. The Ardennes gamble was a catastrophic failure. The German spearhead was blunted, surrounded, and systematically destroyed. Hitler's last reserves of elite armored troops were squandered. But the defeat was more than just tactical. It was philosophical. The Battle of the Bulge proved, once and for all, that the perfect weapon was a strategic dead end. In the brutal, grinding reality of modern warfare, the ability to replace, to refit, and to endure was infinitely more powerful than the ability to build a single, invincible machine. The god of quality had been bled to death by the relentless, unceasing army of good enough. The fires in the Ardennes eventually died down, leaving behind a graveyard of steel. The war in the West was effectively over, and in the aftermath, the men who had led the German war machine, the generals and ministers who had seen their ideology shatter against the wall of American industrial might, began to write. In their secret reports, in their post-war interrogations, and in their memoirs, they would finally give their verdict on Hitler's obsession and the catastrophic miscalculation that had doomed the Third Reich from the very start. Their words would be the final nail in the coffin of the Tiger. The war was over. The cities of the Third Reich lay in ruins, and its leaders were either dead, captured, or in hiding. Now, in the stark, dispassionate light of defeat, the men who had executed Hitler's vision were forced to confront the catastrophic failure of their philosophy. Their words, recorded in diaries, interrogation transcripts, and post-war memoirs, serve as the final, damning testimony in the case of perfection versus production. They are the voices of men who had been given the world's finest sword, only to watch it shatter against an anvil of endless steel. One of the most powerful voices belonged to General Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg and the Inspector General of Armored Troops. Guderian was a brilliant, pragmatic tank commander who understood, better than almost anyone, the realities of armored warfare. Throughout 1943 and 1944, His personal diaries document a series of increasingly frantic and bitter arguments with Hitler. Guderian saw the writing on the wall. He pleaded with the Führer to halt the production of the complex and resource-intensive Tigers and King Tigers. Instead, he begged for a massive increase in the production of the simpler, more reliable, and far cheaper Panzer IV, Germany's equivalent of the Sherman. In one heated exchange, Guderian reportedly told Hitler, "My panzer crews have faith in the Panzer IV. It is a good, honest tank. They are crying out for more of them." Hitler's reply was steeped in his ideological fantasy. The heart of the soldier will be lifted by the sight of the Tiger. This new tank will be worth an entire battalion of lesser machines. After the war, Guderian wrote with resignation about this clash of realities. "I could not get him to see the simple truth, the truth of numbers. The hearts of my panzer men were indeed lifted when they received a Tiger, but they were broken when it inevitably broke down, leaving them stranded. We were fighting a war of attrition, and he was trying to win it with museum pieces." Perhaps no one distilled the futility of the German position more succinctly than Otto Carius. As one of Germany's top tank aces, credited with over 150 kills, Carius was a master of the Tiger. He knew its strengths and weaknesses intimately. He was a tactical genius, but even he could not outsmart the brutal logic of the Allied war machine. His famous, often quoted assessment was not a boast, but a lament, a weary admission of defeat from a man who had seen it all. "We were fighting mathematics, not Americans." Think about the profound depth of that statement. Carius is admitting that the skill of his crew, the power of his gun, the thickness of his armor, all the traditional metrics of combat had become irrelevant. The war was no longer about tactics. It was about production schedules. He wasn't being outfought. He was being outnumbered to a degree that defied military convention. This realization led German commanders to develop a concept they called strategische Lähmung, strategic paralysis. By contrast, they saw the Americans as possessing strategische Freiheit, strategic freedom. A German commander like Carius was strategically paralyzed. Every decision he made was weighed down by the knowledge that his Tiger was an irreplaceable national asset. He couldn't afford to risk it in a bold, flanking maneuver. He couldn't probe aggressively and risk hitting a minefield. He was forced to fight conservatively, to use his precious tank like a semi-static pillbox, preserving it at all costs. This defensive mindset, born from scarcity, robbed the German panzers of the very thing that had once made them great: their audacity and operational freedom. An American commander like General Patton, on the other hand, enjoyed complete strategic freedom. He could afford to be bold, even reckless. He could order an entire armored division to charge across a river, knowing full well he might lose 50 Shermans in the process. Why? Because he also knew that 50 more were already on a train from Antwerp, and another 500 were being loaded onto ships in New York. The Sherman's disposability was not a weakness. It was the ultimate enabler of aggressive, war-winning strategy. Patton wasn't paralyzed by the fear of losing his machines. He was empowered by the certainty of their replacement. The final verdict came from the man who was arguably more responsible for the German war economy than anyone other than Hitler himself, Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and War Production. In his post-war memoirs, Inside the Third Reich, Speer is blunt in his assessment. He admits to being infatuated with the idea of technological superiority. He writes of the immense pride he felt seeing the first Tigers roll out, calling them symbols of our inventive power. But with the clarity of hindsight, he recognized it as a fatal miscalculation. He wrote, "We would have done much better to build twice as many Panzer IVs than the number of Tigers we did. In our pursuit of technical perfection, we lost sight of the broader strategic picture." The war was ultimately decided by the crude power of mass production, a field in which America was hopelessly and predictably our superior. There it is, the admission, from the very top, from the soldier, the general, and the minister. They had been given the perfect weapon, and it had led them to a perfect defeat. Their own words confirmed the chilling truth that Hauptmann Schultz had discovered on that frozen plain on the Eastern Front. The war was not a duel of knights. It was a brutal equation written on a factory floor. And now, all that was left was to tally the final, staggering sum. In the end, it all comes down to the final equation. War, stripped of its flags, its ideologies, and its heroics, is often just a brutal form of accounting. And the final balance sheet for the war of armored philosophies is one of the starkest and most decisive in military history. Let's lay out the final numbers, not as statistics, but as the final, crushing weights on the scales of victory. Germany, with its focus on artisanal perfection and technological marvels, managed to produce a combined total of approximately 1,347 Tiger I tanks and 492 King Tiger tanks. Let's call it a grand total of roughly 1,840 of these perfect machines. The United States, with its doctrine of good enough and its symphony of mass production, rolled out 49,234 M4 Sherman tanks. And even that number doesn't tell the whole story, because America wasn't just equipping its own army. It was the arsenal of democracy. Thousands of those Shermans were shipped to its allies, from the British in the deserts of Africa to the Free French forces fighting to liberate their homeland. And looming on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union, applying its own brutalist form of mass production, had built over 84,000 tons, 3-4 tanks, a machine that embodied the good enough philosophy, perhaps even more completely than the Sherman. So the final equation wasn't one Tiger versus 5 Shermans. It was one Tiger versus a tide of steel so vast it is difficult to comprehend. For every single heavy Tiger tank that Germany produced, the Allies produced more than 70 medium tanks to meet it. It was a war that Germany could never, ever win. The mathematics of annihilation were absolute. But to say that victory was simply a matter of numbers is to miss the deeper, more profound lesson. The numbers were not the cause of victory. They were the symptom of a victorious philosophy. The Sherman didn't win because there were more of them. There were more of them because the philosophy behind the Sherman was a winning one. It was a victory won on multiple, interconnected fronts. First, it was a victory of pragmatic production, a system that values getting a reliable tool into the hands of a soldier today will always triumph over a system that promises a perfect weapon tomorrow. Good enough beat perfect, not because it was better, but because it was there. Second, it was a victory of flexible logistics. A machine designed to be easily repaired and maintained in the field will always have a strategic advantage over a complex machine that requires a workshop and specialized tools. The ability to replace and rebuild is a weapon in itself. Third, it was a victory of societal mobilization. A democratic nation that could tap into the willing, motivated energy of its entire population, its women, its minorities, its private corporations, unleashed a productive force that a totalitarian state, reliant on the coerced labor of slaves, could never hope to match. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, it was a victory of moral design, a system that treats its machines as expendable and its soldiers as priceless will, in the long run, preserve the one resource that truly matters: the fighting spirit and experience of its people. The Americans built a tank designed to be survived. The Germans built a tank that became a steel coffin. The legacy of this conflict is more than just a historical footnote. The story of the Tiger and the Sherman is now a classic case study taught in business schools, in engineering programs, and at military academies around the world. It's the ultimate parable of the minimum viable product, MVP, versus the endless pursuit of a flawless, but ultimately theoretical, masterpiece. It's a lesson about understanding the true nature of the problem you're trying to solve. Germany thought the problem was how to win a tank duel. America understood the problem was how to win a global war. The echoes of this lesson are everywhere. They're in the tech startup that launches a simple, functional app, while its competitor is still endlessly refining a perfect user interface that never sees the light of day. They're in the disaster relief agency that uses simple, reliable trucks to deliver aid, while a more advanced vehicle is stuck waiting for a spare part. The ghosts of the Tiger and the Sherman still haunt our modern world, reminding us that the choices we make are not just about engineering or numbers, but about the philosophies that guide us. They pose a fundamental question about how we confront our own challenges, big and small. A question that forces each of us to decide, what school of thought do we belong to? The story of the Tiger and the Sherman concludes not with the thunder of a final cannonade, but with the quiet, relentless clicking of an adding machine. It's a journey that has taken us from the paranoid delusions of the wolf's lair to the roaring, purposeful symphony of the Detroit tank arsenal. We have stood in the cupola with commanders as they faced a horrifying new kind of warfare, one where their individual skill and courage were rendered meaningless by the cold, hard logic of industrial arithmetic. In the final analysis, the Second World War was not won by the sharpest sword or the thickest armor. It was won by the most resilient system. It was won by the side that understood that, in a conflict of attrition, the ability to replace is more powerful than the ability to perfect. It was won by a philosophy that valued its people over its machines, that embraced the messy, imperfect, but ultimately unstoppable power of good enough. But this story is more than just a history lesson. It is a timeless and powerful metaphor for the choices we all face in our own lives. In every challenge, in every project, in every ambition, we stand at a crossroads, forced to choose between two fundamentally different paths. There is the path of the Tiger. It is the pursuit of absolute perfection. It is the belief that with enough time, enough resources, and enough expertise, a flawless masterpiece can be created that will overwhelm all competition. It is a path of meticulous planning, of artistry, and of uncompromising quality. But it is also a path fraught with danger, the danger of complexity, the risk of delays, and the paralysis that comes from never being quite satisfied, of never being truly finished. And then, there is the path of the Sherman. It is the pursuit of effective application. It is the belief that progress is made through iteration, that a functional solution today is better than a perfect solution tomorrow. It is a path of pragmatism, of simplicity, and of focusing on the core of the problem to get the job done. It embraces imperfection as a necessary part of the process, confident in its ability to adapt, to improve, and to endure. So, we leave you with this question. Look at your own life, your career, your creative pursuits, the way you solve the problems that confront you every day. Which path do you tend to follow? Are you a Tiger, spending months perfecting a single brilliant proposal, striving for an unassailable work of art? Or are you a Sherman, launching a simple, functional version, learning from feedback, and relentlessly moving forward, trusting in the power of momentum? There is no single right answer, and perhaps the greatest wisdom lies in knowing when to be one and when to be the other. But the philosophy you lean on, consciously or not, will fundamentally shape your results. We want to hear your story. The comments section is now your battlefield of ideas. Tell us, are you a Tiger or are you a Sherman? Share a story from your own life, a project at work, a personal goal, a creative endeavor where one of these philosophies made all the difference. And finally, if you believe, as we do, that history is not just a collection of old stories, but a powerful guide for the present and a map for the future, then please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know this story resonated with you, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Our journey into the crucial calculations and hidden philosophies that have shaped our world is far from over. Thank you for watching.